Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Temple Bar. I'm Peter Murray, and I'm chairman of the Temple Bar Trust. But anyway, we are very honoured, really, tonight to be joined by Lord Gus O'Donnell, former civil servant to advise no less than 4 prime ministers: John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and David Cameron. And he was press secretary to the Prime Minister John Major from 1990 to 94. Served as permanent secretary of the UK Treasury from 2002-2005, and then until 2011 was cabinet secretary, which of course is the highest role in the civil service. So who better to discuss Churchill's quote that related to the rebuilding of the Commons Chamber, and it's a quote that brings architecture and politics together. We shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. And Lord O'Donnell is currently chair of Frontier Economics, a director of Brookfield, visiting professor to the LSE and UCL, and is very active in the well-being and happiness movements. And he's a supporter of Action for Happiness. And actually, I went on to the Action for Happiness app, and it said, note for today: may your week be filled with good thought, kind people and happy moments. So I'm sure we're going to tick all those boxes tonight. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Lord O'Donnell.
Thank you. Right, this is pretty intimidating to me because I have never spoken to a room full of architects, ever, I can say. We might want to talk about why there aren't many architects in government and what's going wrong there. That would be quite a useful thing to do. So I'm basically started life as an academic economist, teaching at the University of Glasgow. That's been my profession throughout the whole time, and that's one of the things I've relied upon in all the jobs I've done, is my understanding of economics. So architecture, where we come into it actually is a lot, most recently in stuff we set up when David Cameron came in the behavioural insights team, where we talked about nudges and we talked about the nature of, and then suddenly people began to think about buildings, design, what it all does. So I'm learning, all right? So you just have to realise. I thought what I would do today is basically talk about the part that I know well, which is Downing Street, and the relationship between the buildings there and what goes on inside, and how the buildings have shaped, as we heard earlier, the way British politics works. And I'll go across to Parliament a little bit as well to show that these things do matter, and that there are lots of interactions which I'm sure all of you will pick up far more than I have as a kind of crude economist. So I'm going to go through, first of all, the way I think about buildings is like the history, first of all. Then I'm going to think about, well, Downing Street, what's it like to live in? What's it like to work in? What kind of space is it? What does it do to people inside? What happens inside? And I'll give you some examples of things that I've lived through. And then maybe we'll move on to, when we've discussed that, the kind of inside number 10, what's really going on, the relationship between all of that and our politics, and a little bit about Parliament. So that's the plan, and then plenty of time for Q&A. So we're going to start off, if this works, I'm hoping. Whitehall from St James's, circa 1675. You probably know all of this better than I do, but that's what it looked like. Very, very different. We're in a world where London has a population of about 500,000. Right? It's about to grow fairly rapidly. Downing Street doesn't exist at all, right? So basically you've got Henry VIII living, Whitehall Palace stretches all along Whitehall. You've got his palace, but you've got all sorts of various outbuildings. For example, one of them is a cockpit, which is actually to this day in Cabinet Office. I've actually worked and walked past it. And so that's basically where we were, relatively rural. So then along comes this man called Downing, and I just couldn't believe, as I kind of investigated what Downing is all about. So 1682, to 84, George Downing, who was a sort of chaplain, sort of preacher for the army, becomes important. He has moved on and he's now a spec builder, basically in your terms, and he puts up some terraced houses in Downing Street, which are very cheap, very shoddy. It's very boggy land. I mean, Grant and I were talking about the problems of London sinking because the Thames had gone a lot further in those days. Very boggy land, not very good, and they're kind of not used that much. Downing himself is a really interesting character. He basically became chief spy to Oliver Cromwell, right? And he was, I think it's fair to say, a bit of a rogue and not a man to trust at all. I think some politicians can't be trusted. Downing was kind of in a character all of his own. So he's, 1 minute he's with Cromwell, the next minute he's with the king, and he's going back and forward, and then he ends up in The Hague. Now, if any of you have read Robert Harris's book, Act of Oblivion, so Act of Oblivion was passed when we get a restoration of the monarchy, and basically all of those people that signed a death warrant, they need to find them, and the Act of Oblivion says find them and bring them back and we'll execute them. Really gory executions as well. If you read the book, it's like not nice. And the book Act of Oblivion is about two of them who went off to America and were hunted down. Downing was in The Hague for the king, and his former, when he was the chaplain in the army, his captain of the army was a captain called John Oakey, who basically he dobbed in, to use a technical term, and betrayed him, and he came back and was gruesomely executed. So that was Downing for you. He came back and was actually accused of cowardice, was put in the tower. All sorts of things happened to him. He also, I should say, think of some nice things to say about him. As a former permanent secretary of the Treasury, he was quite good on thinking about how to collect taxes and how to issue bonds. Which, not everybody thinks collecting taxes is a nice thing, but quite keen on that. So that happens 682 to 84. The house is used by all sorts of different people, no one particularly exciting. 1732, King George II gives it, tries to give it as a gift to Walpole. Now Walpole, this is where you have to understand the politics of this. We didn't have a thing called Prime Minister really. They were kind of primus inter pares, right? So there was the cabinet, and believe me, it was kind of quite unlike the cabinet we have today in the sense of, the idea that there will be a written record of cabinet. Like I spent a lot of my time doing as cabinet secretary, no chance. But Walpole was quite canny, and George wanted to give this to him because the house was, surprise, surprise, still falling down, still sinking, massive amount of work needed. It was tiny. It was ridiculous to have a prime minister living in it. So basically, what he said was, I'm going to take it in my capacity as First Lord of the Treasury. Smart, right? What does that mean? That means it's still owned by the public, right? And therefore, the public pay for the maintenance and restoration. And to this day, when you hear about, David Cameron spent a lot of money on the kitchen or whatever, it's a public building, therefore there's a certain amount of money put aside to maintain and renovate Downing Street, right? Not enough, never is enough in public buildings, but there's a certain amount put aside. So he very cannily said, right, I'm going to keep it in the hands of the First Lord of the Treasury. And if you ever go to Downing Street and you look at that famous door, you will see there's the brass plate which says First Lord of the Treasury, right? Which is kind of like, always annoys you when you're in the Treasury, It's like, Chancellor, surely. Anyway, that's there. And sometimes they kind of use that. So Walpole makes the most of this, extends into the house at the back, as it were. It becomes much bigger, and we see the whole estate starting to bloom. And this is used quite successfully for a short time. And then it goes into decline. The whole area, this is the one where And I'm trying to track down Anthony Seldon. Some of you may know Anthony Seldon. He writes lots of books about prime ministers, kind of instant history. He's just done the Boris Johnson one. Anthony is, I know very well, and I've given him lots of interviews about various things. He's said, and I couldn't get him to tell me exactly this, but by 1846, in the region of Downing Street, there are 170 brothels and 145 gin houses. I mean, the area has just gone to the pits. There's a place called the Devil's Acre, which Charles Dickens writes about. So it's pretty grim, right? And in the middle of this, we've got Parliament and we've got Downing Street. So 1849, and remember, London is growing by this time. So you've got Parliament sitting there, London's growing, the Thames stinks to high heaven. It absolutely stinks. In 1849, 18,000 people in London died of cholera. By 1854, it was 24,000. So you can see where this is all going. It's just gruesome. Anyway, it doesn't carry on like that. We come back to a more reasonable situation. And by 1902, Arthur Balfour, Conservative Prime Minister, moves in. And from then on, it's the convention. And I stress, it's a convention. There is no requirement for Prime Ministers to live in Downing Street. It's the convention. And he went there, and since then, nearly all of them have decided to do that. Tony Blair and Cherie had a conversation with them about not doing so, about living in their house at home. Security nightmare. I mean, just unbelievable security nightmare. There are a number of people you just don't want to go there. So, fortunately, they're all staying there, which is good. And now, okay, so what's it like to be? Well, first of all, you've got to ask about location. So let's talk about what it looks like. Now, we're up to modern times now. Here's the place I spent a lot of my life. This is the Treasury. Big drum in the middle, the Treasury, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. We all like the tax collectors, don't we? Yeah, give them a cheer. Over here is Parliament, just to locate you. The Foreign Office, big, grand, always above themselves, you know. Here we have number 10, and the Garden, and Horse Guards Parade, which I'll come on to. So that's basically the architecture of power. You want to be close to these things, and that's really very important. As you're living there, so that's the location. It's a bit better now, not quite so many brothels. Just check this, yeah. It's still Downing Street, not very well put together, right? It requires a lot of maintenance. If you go into the Houses of Parliament now, you'll see it's just falling down. Downing Street's been like that for a long time. I spent my time as Cabinet Secretary with various Prime Ministers saying, we really need to do some work on this. And if we're going to do serious work, you're going to have to move out. I only convinced, well, actually, it wasn't me that did this, thank God. One Prime Minister decided to do the right thing and do it for the rest of the people. He would move out. And where he moved, and this was John Major, he moved to there, Admiralty House. Admiralty House, perfectly nice place to be a Prime Minister, apart from one thing, really. It's not really organised for the 21st century, or even, anything like that. So, John Major moves there, and we have Black Wednesday. Those of you who obviously don't remember Black Wednesday, we were spending $1 billion an hour. 1 billion an hour on trying to prop up the pound to stay in exchange rate mechanism. And we had Eddie George in the corner on a phone, right? Eddie George, Governor of the Bank of England, on a phone, trying to work out what's happening to the exchange rate. I mean, it was a complete joke, right? Total joke, and rather expensive. So that's what happens when you move out of Downing Street. So since then, no one. When you put it to them, they're like, no, the next guy can do it. So it's kind of hard to get it maintained. So it's a rolling thing. So that's the house. So the location, not bad. What about in terms of living there? I mean, the main thing about living there is, and now, think about life as a Prime Minister, right? It's the unhealthiest existence known to man, right? First of all, you live above the shop, right? So in terms of your exercise during the day, let me take you through a normal Prime Minister's day. Right, wakes up, gets in the lift, goes downstairs. All the meetings are there because everyone goes to a Prime Minister. Prime Minister doesn't go to anybody else, so he's there. If there is a meeting outside, or let's say he goes to Parliament, there is a car outside, right? It's not very far from there to there, but it's very insecure because it's predictable. There's a time, right? It's all the things you really, really don't do. It's like the coronation. It's like you don't do a coronation. You put everybody together, 180 leaders in the same place at a predictable time. You don't do that, right? That's why everybody breathed a sigh of relief when it was over. So he gets in the car, walks out. He does his possibly 20 steps for the day, and he's got his Fitbit out, 20. Gets in the car, goes to Parliament, does another 20 steps, and comes back. If he goes out to a dinner or whatever, same rigmarole, right? There is no exercise built into this day. If you don't do anything, and if you try and do something, you go out with your security guards, and the cameras will be there, and they'll see you, and you're not that elegant in your jogging stuff, so it's not perfect. So it's incredibly unhealthy. Then there's the question of the family. So where are you going to put the family? So living accommodation for number 10 Downing Street is above. There are two flats above. There's a flat above number 11 and a flat above number 10. The flat above number 11 is much bigger than the flat above number 10. Don't ask me why. Now, this is a problem. So when Tony Blair becomes Prime Minister, he's got a young family. Gordon Brown is Chancellor. Obvious thing is for them to swap the flats. If any of you have ever spoken between Gordon and Tony, which I did because I was Gordon's permanent secretary and then Gordon's and went to be Tony's cabinet secretary and then Gordon's cabinet secretary, you'll realise that nothing's quite that simple. So there were a few negotiations, and in the end that's what happened. The number 11 flat becomes Prime Minister's, number 10, L1. Gordon doesn't like this arrangement, so Gordon basically says, I haven't got the big flat, I'm off, and he stayed in his own flat in London, not in Downing Street. So, security problems, but not great security problems, because bizarrely enough, the security arrangements for a Prime Minister are up there. The security arrangements for other ministers are much, much lower. It's quite dramatically different. And hence you don't need all the paraphernalia that goes with it. So that's the flats and the living. And of course, when they're in the flats, so Tony Blair arrives in Downing Street. It's the first time we've ever had a Prime Minister with young children. And we're like going through the diary, and it's like, this is time for storytelling upstairs. So, okay, we have to kind of factor that in. The president's on the phone for you. No, story time. So you have to kind of work around the realities of people's lives. And like David Cameron and Gordon Brown both had disabled kids, so lots of stuff you need to do to adjust for those sorts of things. So it's become, a world, and of course, you've got kids running around in Downing Street, which is just lovely, and it's just fantastic when you think of all the things you're doing. Suddenly, there's a bit of family life, a bit of reality comes in. So that's quite fun, and that's quite nice. That's the living bit. The area, as like I say, has gone up a bit, but you can't really go out. Why can't you go out? Well, here we go. The gates. 1920, we introduced a barrier in Downing Street. Gates across there. Does anyone know why we did that?
Suffragettes.
No. Good. I thought it was the suffragettes as well. But it turns out to be protesters in favour of an Irish Free State. So is Ireland. And 2 years later, of course, we give there is an Irish Free State, so the barriers come down. So they went, reinstituted 1989, and I remember quite vividly, the whole thing about poll tax riots outside, because I was working for John Major when the transition from Major to Thatcher, Thatcher to Major happened. So, and now we have no public access because of that. And I mean, what it means is, from an architectural point of view as well, and also from a press secretary's point of view, let me use that. You've got the street. What you've got is a street and a door. And wow, who would think a street and a door could be that useful, right? So we use the street and the door quite a lot. Let me move on. Here we go. Here's an example. You mentioned Ireland. It's always been quite a big issue. This is Albert Reynolds, the Taoiseach. We are having talks before the first ever ceasefire in Northern Ireland, which John Major played an absolute blinder, handed over to Tony Blair, who also did an amazing job in bringing peace to Northern Ireland. So there they are, and there's the door, number 10. And that is the iconic image that you want around the world. People think of this as a lovely oak door. Nah, steel. I mean, that. So yeah, I can tell you about one of my moments, which my wife really remembers, vividly, I'm sure. When I was in Downing Street, the first Gulf War. I have to stress the first Gulf War, right? I hope everyone remembers what the first Gulf War was. 35 countries, right, who trying to get Saddam Hussein, who'd invaded Kuwait, kicked out of Kuwait, which they did, and then stopped because there wasn't a UN resolution to go any further. Very successful war. I was on the Gulf War Committee, which was meeting in the Cabinet Office, which was meeting in the Cabinet Room in number 10 Downing Street, when we come back to the Irish. The IRA lob a mortar bomb over the top from a white van, over the top and into the garden. Now, I can say this now. I did get this. If it had landed on the ceiling, you'd be listening to somebody else, right? Because we've now reinforced the roof, so it's fine. But it did mean that, and this is the example of how sophisticated the security arrangements in the cabinet room are. The explosion goes off. The windows are that sort of cubed glass, and we have these curtains with lead weights at the bottom. And the glass comes in, curtains billow out, and the glass falls to the floor. That's really sophisticated, isn't it? Lead weights at the bottom of the curtains. It worked, yeah, exactly, it worked. But it does mean that, I do remember those days in the IRA, that was quite something, yeah. Right, so this is iconic. Every Prime Minister who comes into Downing Street stops at the outside the front door, so you get the global picture, and they do their first speech, right? What they're going to do inside, what they're going to say, what they're going to achieve, and the remarkable thing is how similar they all are, right? They are all going to bring the country together, right? They're all going to do that. They are all going to restore trust in politics. I mean, I can quote something, and it's just, I could go on. And at the end of it all, they all say, and now I need to get on with work. And they turn around and walk through the front door. And of course, this has to be timed quite well because you can't actually open the door from the outside. The person inside presses the button and it opens, right? So it's, you can imagine just walking at the door. Obviously, activists, civil servants, that's what it is. Yeah. So, the other thing about greeting people there that I remember exactly, this relates to what number 10 is useful for, is that's a place at the doorstep where prime ministers can be global leaders. So, for example, during the global financial crisis, Gordon Brown was prime minister. We were the chair of the G20 at the time. We brought all of the leaders of the G20 over here. The actual conference was in the Excel Centre. And they all came to the door, cameras are all there, greeted by Gordon and Sarah, his wife. And then I was just the other side of that, and I would take them up to the upstairs. We have entertaining rooms, large rooms you can entertain in. And one of the people I remember was taking President Obama up there, a brand new President Obama, who was incredibly helpful during the talks. Unlike most American presidents, he was kind of like, okay, so what would you want me to do? I'm like, I've never heard that from an American man. You wouldn't hear that from Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton would just love you all. The idea he would say something like that. So Obama was brilliant, and we took him upstairs and showed him that view. And you remember, you look over the horse guards, and of course the horse guards had a lot of activity going on in it. He said, "What's going on?" I said, "Well, that's going to be beach volleyball." He got very interested in that. He said, "There's going to be some great sights." Yeah, probably right. So that's the door. The garden. I mentioned about the garden. This is where they landed the two mortar bombs. That's quite close to the buildings, and it's the site of where you have parties. In my day, we had lots of parties for the press, for the Prime Minister will entertain members of his party. You know, someone's wavering, you give them an invite to the garden. You know, you talk them round. And there have been some other parties there, post my time, so nothing to do with me, so I'm not even going there. So, that's the architecture. What about, as it were, the inside? Let's go inside. And here, this is my favourite picture because it's, David Cameron, when I retired, gave me this picture, signed it by him. So, when a new Prime Minister arrives in number 10, they are greeted at the door by the Cabinet Secretary. Prime Minister arrives with their wife, Sam Camp, a very pregnant Sam Camp. So they're greeted, and then the number 10 staff, who have about an hour earlier clapped out we line up along the corridor, we clap out the outgoing Prime Minister, and we clap in the new one, right? Doesn't take long. And when they've come through that, this is just inside the cabinet room, right? So I've whizzed around the back, and you can just see it because, you know, he's just beginning to realise, I'm Prime Minister, bloody hell. And Sam is thinking, oh, well, you know, like, okay, I'm pregnant, you know, I'm moving to somewhere new that I don't like the kitchen of, and my husband's going to be Prime Minister, and that means he's not going to have any time. Apart from that, it's all fine, isn't it? And it gets worse after that, right? So he comes into that room, and then I sit him down and say, well, Prime Minister, there's a few envelopes here that I need you to fill in. And those envelopes contain the targeting instructions for our nuclear submarines. So basically, Prime Minister, and obviously he's given quite a lot of briefing on this, and he doesn't have to make up his mind straight away, but, you know, let's imagine a world where London's been nuked by the Russians or whoever, and what do you want our CASD, our continuous at-sea deterrence, our nuclear submarines to do? So you fill in what you want them to do, put it in the envelope, we seal it, and then it goes out to the submarines who are continuously at sea, you know, in rotation, obviously. If the signal comes, they open up the safe and decide. You know, they don't decide, they do what is on the piece of paper. And we don't know what's on the piece of paper. Once one Prime Minister's gone, those are destroyed, and I don't know, I have no idea how any of the Prime Ministers filled them in. Just as well, really. And the only people who genuinely know are the Prime Ministers themselves. And there's every reason for them to lie about it. If you think about it, the whole point of deterrence is uncertainty. You know, they just don't know. They just don't know how we would respond. And that's why we've got nuclear deterrent. So he has, you know, so once I've taken him through that, just kind of minor thing, we then talk about a bit of counter-terrorism, you know, there's a few plots that we've got some groups, and somehow or other we've lost a few of them, and then, oh, by the way, we're now going to think about, you know, selecting your cabinet, and I need to give you a briefing about one or two of them who
only one or two.
That was in my time. Okay. The numbers may have gone up a little. Yeah. So there you are. This is it. But at the same time, right, so the staff have gone back to their offices. What you've got then is this mad free-for-all, right? So actually you try and organise this in advance because you've had access talks with the Leader of the Opposition as to who's going to go in which office. So you've got cabinet room. Then next to it is a kind of private office that usually the principal private secretary goes in. Sometimes the chief of staff goes in. For Tony Blair, it was Jonathan Powell, for example. So sometimes a mixture of special advisors, civil servants. It can be different sorts of things, but everyone is fighting for access. They all want to be as close as possible, and this is where you architects come in. Like, how can we possibly ensure that the access is restricted and that not everybody can just rush in and say to the Prime Minister, I think this is a good idea. And if one of our Prime Ministers, well, quite recent ones, would say, yes, you're absolutely right. And then someone else would come in and say the opposite, and he'd say, yes, you're absolutely right. That is chaos, right? That does not work, believe me. So you need to kind of control this, and you need as it were, gatekeepers. And there's usually a political advisor, political secretary to the Prime Minister, who's usually the gatekeeper on the political side, and there's private secretaries who are gatekeepers on the civil service side, to make sure that all of this happens. It's quite interesting how it works, that everyone goes into the Prime Minister's office by going through the private office. Actually, I can tell you this, you could go in through the cabinet room, but nobody does, because we tell them they can't, right? And actually, sometimes we lock it as well. But I mean, it's quite interesting that they kind of follow the desired form of how you do it. So access is hugely important. It is like a political TARDIS, right? There's loads of rooms in there. Everyone's crammed in. They're tiny. They're really not very suitable for the work that's done. There's the policy unit. It depends on prime ministers what groups they've got. You can have a policy unit. You can have people doing kind of blue skies thinking. You've got political staff, you've got parliamentary staff, you've got all sorts of different people. And they're all stuck in there, trying to do their own thing, desperate to get near to the Prime Minister. Now, what about civil servants? Well, that's all number 10, right? You've got Cabinet Office. So as I showed you that part about number 10, along from it is the Cabinet Office, right? And the Cabinet Office is where lots more civil servants lead. And so in number 10, you've just got the Prime Minister. In the Cabinet Office, you've got a number of other ministers, or junior ministers, and you've got a lot of civil servants, and you've got some special advisors. For example, when we had the coalition, Gordon's in number 10, David Cameron's in number 10, Nick Clegg is in Cabinet Office, and looking for the best room in Cabinet Office. Now, this is where it gets very difficult, right? Because the best room in the Cabinet Office is the Cabinet Secretary's room. And that's the way it's going to stay, right? And you do deals. While we were negotiating for the coalition, I was talking to Nick Clegg. He said, look, I just need a brilliant civil servant to work with me as my private secretary. And I said, well, there's a lot we can look around. And he said, no, I've worked it out. Your private secretary, a guy called Callum Miller. He said, him, I want him. It's like, he's mine. It's like, him or the room. Okay. So Callum, no, we did decide that Callum was the best person. And that was a great team. But in Cabinet Office, you are cut off from the Prime Minister. You have to go through these doors that became quite famous during the Partygate stuff, because all sorts of bad things were happening around the doors. And the Cabinet Secretary clearly has to have access to the Prime Minister at all times. Now, why that's important is I'm going to remind you of this. I hope this works. So that's that episode, if you remember, where they changed the lock on the. It's now one of those, if you've ever seen Spooks, one of those things you go into and come out of it. They've got those now. So, yeah, I mean, if you can't get in to see the Prime Minister, which is why, one of the important things is when I was Cabinet Secretary, I was also head of the Civil Service. When I left, they split the job, which I was against, to be honest, but neither the Prime Minister nor Jeremy Hayward, who's taking over as Cabinet Secretary, wanted to do both jobs. So, but what that means is, as your head of Civil Service, you don't get much access because you are literally not that close. As Cabinet Secretary, I'm talking to the Prime Minister virtually every day about what we're going to do in Cabinet, who's going to, how are we going to manage these things, how do we manage the Deputy Prime Minister, whoever the Deputy Prime Minister today happens to be. We've got Cabinet colleagues doing this, Parliament's revolting, as always. So you've got lots to talk about, so it's quite useful to have all of that. So that's kind of like to Humphrey. Let's think about now, how does this look globally? How do we compare? And let's look at this. This is the bloody Elysee. I mean, it's huge, right? It's huge. It's wonderful. I mean, there is a slight difference in that we have a Prime Minister, and constitutionally then we have a monarch. So Buckingham, maybe we could put Buckingham Palace up there. But the reality is Macron is a serious president who has serious power. The King now has soft power, but constitutionally very, very little power. Could go into the details of all that, but that's the reality of it. But it's not fair, is it? It's really not fair. If you go to this is, again, the president of Germany lives there. If I were to tell you that we're the Chancellor of Germany, the nearest equivalent to our Prime Minister, that is the largest political headquarters in the world. So it's not fair, is it? I mean, come on. And then the worst thing, the White House. We've all seen West Wing. That tells you about the nature of how important proximity is. I mean, they're all arguing for it. And they've got a lot more space than us. So it's not fair. But I'm going to pass over that. I'm not jealous. Now we come on to, so we're living there, right? It's fine. What do you care about? You've got to think about the neighbours. So what do we do about this? Here we have, as a typical example of your next door neighbour, David Cameron and George Osborne. Now, they worked very closely together in opposition, and they were going to be, because the relationship between Prime Ministers and Chancellors is an absolutely crucial one, and it quite often goes wrong. So I remember the first time I became a press secretary was working for Nigel Lawson. And about 7 weeks after I'd become press secretary, such was my brilliance, he'd resigned. Gone. Fallen out with Alan Walters, who was the economic advisor in Number 10. So that relationship is absolutely crucial. John Major had a very good relationship with Ken Clarke, for example. Norman Lamont, he basically got on with his chancellors. Very important. Gordon and Tony, TBGBs, as we used to call it. Massive creative tension, but actually, when you think about independent central bank and all sorts of other things, got an enormous amount done. These two come in. So when I had access talks with them, so access talks are things where the Prime Minister gives you the tick to go and talk to the opposition ahead of an election, and you're allowed to go and listen to them, because they might want to say, by the way, I don't want to live in 10 Downing Street, I want to live in Islington, or wherever. And you say, really? Oh. And you kind of think about how you're going to change their minds, basically. So these David and George had decided they wanted to work together, and that George was going to operate out of 11 Downing Street. Now, hardly any chancellors do that. Nigel Lawson did it for a while. And the reason they don't do it is because the Treasury, surprise, surprise, is a very powerful department, has a lot of civil servants in it who can tell you the answers to things you need to know. Like, explain to me the fiscal rules again. What is it the Bank of England's doing? Why are they putting interest rates up? All those sorts of things. And George decided that no, he would basically work out of number 11 and go back to the Treasury, which is, again, physically quite a walk. Have to get past the Foreign Office to do it. And that lasted about 3 weeks. And it was like, it's not going to work. And George realised he was losing an enormous amount of power by not being close to Treasury officials. So he was basically, I'm not doing this, I'm going back. And that's another interesting part of the way that, because number 11 Downing Street is very small as well. There's no room for many officials there. You have 2 or 3, but you couldn't bring most of your office there. But the neighbours really matter, and having those two really close together really matters. Because if you think about all the things that Prime Ministers are talking about, public spending, what to do with the NHS, well, these are all about matters where the Treasury has a huge say. If the two of them have decided on something, that's it, basically. Chancellor and Prime Minister, that's where the power lies. Obviously on foreign policy, Secretary of State, foreign secretaries, we like to think they're very important, but actually the biggest calls on foreign policy come down to Prime Ministers. So again, that relationship has to be good. I remember John Major and Douglas Hurd, who was his foreign secretary, had a brilliant relationship. I mean, just to give you one example of that brilliant relationship, I said I was there when Margaret Thatcher stood down and there was a leadership election. Surprise, surprise. And this time, it's only MPs doing the leadership thing. John Major stands, Douglas Hurd stands, very patrician, much better known. John Major's kind of the new boy. And I was with them in the Treasury when Douglas Hurd came in to talk to John Major. And they said, well, how's it going? Have you got much support? And John Major said, well, I'm quite surprised, really, rather more than I expected. And Douglas said, well, same for me. And let's get our lists out. So they both got their lists out. Boy, me, how many people were on both lists? Unbelievable. And they said, that's really interesting. So we've now got 25 people we're not going to trust again. That shaped the next reshuffle, I can tell you. Getting on with the neighbours, really, really important. And the geography means that they're close together, and but they choose to be further apart. The next one along, so you've got number 10, number 11, number 12, is the Whip's office. That obviously gives you the parliamentary side of things and making sure that they behave themselves, the Parliament behaves themselves. Now, when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, after taking over from Tony, he decided to move into number 12, briefly, as his main office, and stick up a horseshoe. He'd been over to New York and seen Mayor Bloomberg, and Bloomberg had a horseshoe, and he decided that he'd do the same in number 12, which was unusual and difficult, and I wouldn't say I think it's the most effective way of doing things, but it was something he wanted, and so we made it work. You basically, that's our job. So you can alter the way you use those three places, and they all need to work closely together. Okay, so now, finally from me, what are the implications for our politics for all of this? Well, first of all, you've got the Prime Minister being right at the centre of things. And we are a system which is very centralised, gives a lot of power to our Prime Ministers, particularly if they have a decent sized majority in the House. Right? So they are able to do a lot. And in fact, Parliament, can be what Lord Hailsham called an elective dictatorship. If you've got a decent enough majority, got reasonably well-behaved MPs, you can just push anything through you like. And us in the House of Lords, we can slow things down. The Parliament Act means we can send it back to the Commons, but ultimately they send it back and say get lost. And in the end, they because they are the elected chamber, their view stands. So the checks and balances are quite limited. So we have a very strong centralised system, and 10 Downing Street kind of typifies that. Small, underneath there. I should have mentioned in the Cabinet Office end, you've got Cobra, which is the Cabinet Office briefing room. It's not very well. Anyway, that's where the crisis management is done, and everyone comes together, and that's very efficient. So it's efficient, small, and it's not as labyrinthine as some other organisations. So I think that's a great example of it. You're very near Parliament. Parliament matters a lot at times, I stress. And a Parliament is designed, as you all know, in a very adversarial way. They're a sword length apart. And it's made to be government versus opposition. And the words themselves tell you it. The government is there to govern, they make the decisions. The opposition is there to oppose. They oppose the decisions. It's not whether they think they're good or not. That's just that's the way we set things up. And if you look at other parliamentary chambers, they're round. And they are, if you look at, for example, when I was sorting out negotiating coalition, we never had a coalition. in the UK post-Second World War. We've got some examples from the devolved, but continental Europe, lots of coalitions. Sometimes takes them a lot longer. We did it in 5 days. Belgians, many months. Sometimes a year. But there is something about that system, and they kind of built into it the idea of coalitions. For us, when we had a coalition, we had to start from scratch. We didn't know. We had no precedents. I, being a smart bureaucrat, decided that I would create this thing called the Coalition Committee, which would have a group weighted by their overall weight in Parliament, so it's basically 6-1, Conservatives to Lib Dems, and this would meet twice a week to sort out any disagreements. It met twice. Total waste of time, complete disaster. What it didn't factor in was the fact that David Cameron and Nick Clegg knew they were in this together, they trusted each other, so the decision-making body was the Quad, which was 4 people, George Osborne and Danny Alexander, both in Treasury. You then got the cementing of Treasury and Number 10. Once they sort things out, you're there. So that's the neighbours. Very important. This, of course, is something I wanted to end on. You can think about, civil servants get to stay through changes of Prime Minister, but there are this ruthless killer, Chief Mouser in Number 10, brought in by David Cameron, survived the change to Theresa May and Johnson and Truss, and is now serving for Rishi Sunak. So there are some things that carry on. And Larry is one of them. And with that, I will hand back.
Well, thank you, Gus. That was splendid. So do take a seat, and we've got a bit of time for Q&A. Perhaps I've got a couple of things I'd like to ask. You were just talking about coalition. So if Keir Starmer came to you and said, I haven't quite got enough people, I might look at a coalition, would you say good idea or bad idea? Because I remember talking to Vince Cable afterwards, and he felt very bruised at the end of that last one.
First of all, I'd be expecting them to have those conversations much earlier. That's the sort of thing you sort out long in advance. And coalition isn't the only form. So it's a supply and confidence deal. The Lib Dems are, you're absolutely right, there are a number of them chastened by being in coalition. But it's exactly, I think, I'm slightly surprised by the Vince thing in the sense, they knew this would happen. They knew that if they went into coalition, they would be, to use the technical term, completely screwed, right? Because they were with the Conservatives. There's only a certain amount of trust there can be. That's the reason for the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which moved Parliament to 5 years, because they thought that without that, the Tories, when they got ahead in the polls, would just have another, Prime Minister would just call an election, and, throw out the Lib Dems and operate on his own. So you need to kind of find ways to build trust. If there isn't sufficient trust to have a full coalition, which I have to say, I think worked surprisingly well, you would have a supply and confidence deal, which basically means issue by issue, you sort things out. And there are various ways of doing that. But it's much less stable. It can fall apart quite quickly. But I think because of the history, you may be right. It may be that there just isn't the trust there because of what happened last time, and because they felt that they were targeted last time, that they can't do it. But I would be saying, if you get the power, if you're the Lib Dems and you get the power and you can be in government, I mean, surely that's what you're a political party for. I found it very amazing when we were discussing with Nick Clegg about bringing in special advisors from the Lib Dems, right? And there aren't many of them, right? There aren't many kind of Lib Dems they wanted to bring in. But I was saying, what about these two? They're working in think tanks, they seem to know a lot about this policy or whatever. And they're like, But, I mean, they've spent their lives criticising government, and now, they don't want to be held accountable for being in government. It's like, oh my God, So I do hope that they will not rule out coalition entirely. But obviously the politics of how you manage the election to get to that place will play a part in that. So there may be a bit of constructive ambiguity in what they say.
And my last question is that you talked about lots of small rooms. Is the planning and layout of 10 Downing Street such that you could hold riotous parties without the Cabinet Secretary knowing they were indoors?
Well, at this point, I have to remind you that the Cabinet Secretary is in the Cabinet Office. So there are plenty of big rooms to have parties in, and the garden. So, yeah.
Right, thank you. Yes, right, golly, right, where should we start? But I'll start at the back, yes. If you can say who you are, please.
Hello, I'm Martin Evans. Can I ask you about the renovation of the Palace of Westminster?
Yeah.
Because obviously that's been on the agenda for a very long
Yeah.
time. Beginning of last year, I think there was a report that said that it might take 76 years and cost £22 billion, and given that the Shard costs just more than £1 billion to build.
Yeah.
How do you think that's going to get resolved? What do you think is going to happen? Because I guarantee you there's a lot of robust views in this room about how that might work.
I mean, I would say that what we've seen so far is a very good example. It's a bit like House of Lords reform. I mean, everyone talks about it and they never do it. And there are very good reasons why they don't do it, because basically it gets blocked by the House of Commons. And the House of Commons itself will then, no one wants to vote for spending loads of money on a renovation, taxpayers' money now, for a renovation that they will only see the downside of. You know, you have to realise these are MPs who don't see themselves being there that long. So my guess is this will muddle along, and it will be one of those things that everyone's in favour of. Like my namesake, St Augustine, Lord give me chastity, but not yet. You know.
There's some in the middle. Yes.
Oh, me? Oh. It was quite telling, the first thing that you said about not being in a room full of architects. So I'm presuming meaning there's very little architects in the civil service, and we know very little architects in government. And why do you think that is? And do you think maybe it could benefit from a little bit of three-dimensional thinking?
It's a very good question, because when you think of the professional groups who have operated successfully in government, you know, that I would say, and I'm biased in this, obviously, the economists. I regard the economists as the Japanese knotweed in government, right? Just go everywhere, right? And because they kind of like, you want an answer, yeah, we'll do a cost-benefit analysis, we'll give you an answer, you know, we'll do the pros and cons, we can assess things, we can deal with uncertainty, we do decision-making under uncertainty, we do all the stuff you need, right? And here's the answers, and here are the options. And I remember talking to a chief scientist about, you know, why don't we get more scientists in? And the scientists said, well, they don't want to get involved with the grubby work of politicians. They want to be independent. And it's like, well, and the economists are like, no, we want to get in there. We want to get in the policy room. And the scientists want to be very pure and independent. And that sort of thing creates problems. And the architects, I don't know why the architects haven't got involved. I mean, you have to be pushy to get in. You have to say how you're going to add value. And you obviously can add huge amount of value given the amount you charge. So I'm sure you'd be important and valuable. But like I say, the only area where I've seen it kind of really come in is when people have started to talk about behaviour change and climate change, both of those, in terms of what does that mean for our architecture. I mean, one of the things, you know, I live in despair of in the Treasury is, you know, everyone talked about, you know, how can we improve our growth rate, and everybody's talked about more housing, and it never happens. Never happens. You know, you can dream up, we've dreamt up all sorts of policies. Never happens. Because, I don't know, you know, there is something about our planning system which is fundamentally broken, which you probably know more about than I do, but it's a real mess. And the net result is that we don't build many houses.
That'll be a future meeting. Yes.
Gordon Adams, Battersea Power Station. Thank you, Lord O'Donnell. That was brilliant. I could have listened to you all night. Can often be criticism from various sectors when something goes wrong and saying, well, of course that happened. Number 10 was never designed to function like an office. It's a rabbit warren. So, you know, but do you think that it works despite that, and that, you know, had your time, you would keep it that way, or if you had a magic wand, would you just wipe it all away and then build a very functional box that was more sort of modern and efficient and more on the elite station.
Right, I do like Battersea Power Station. I grew up going to school in Battersea, so. Would I change it all? There are bits that I love about it. The mistake, the street, the door, the fact that it's relatively humble. I like the fact we've got a relatively small place compared to the French and the Germans and the Americans, and could have named many others. I think it's those are the advantages. The disadvantages, you're absolutely right, are that, you know, in a modern office, you really want things to be a bit smoother. You know, you would like to have, you know, when you see the way in which you can display things graphically now, and, you know, some of the, I mean, you mostly see these in the movies, but I mean, there are places where you know, Bloomberg's place, that you can do things which would be a lot better and more efficient. But I think the history also makes them think quite hard about their role and the legacy they'll leave. And it, you know, democratic politics by its nature, you know, you take something like New Zealand's 3-year terms, they're going to be relatively short term. We've got up to 5 years now, whenever the Prime Minister chooses to fire the starting gun, which is ridiculous in itself. So why, you know, anything which makes them think about history, about the long-term impact they're having, I think is a really good thing. And I think therefore the history of Downing Street, I think helps. Yeah, the individual rooms and the fighting and the way that everyone's like that is pretty awful.
Was one at the back?
Actually, it was the same question, so you can pass it on.
Right, okay. Yes, Richard.
Yes, Lord O'Donnell, you discussed why there weren't architects in politics. But I would like to ask the opposite question. Why is it that the biggest industry in the country is so underrepresented or underconsidered in government? We have agriculture, which is sort of 1% of GDP, which has its own ministry. I reckon that the built environment adds up to around 20% of the economy and enables all the rest. Your government is the biggest customer, it is the regulator, and it's supposed to be the sponsor. But it doesn't do any of those things in a systematic way, and it doesn't put the pieces together with the result that you don't get a country which is designed and managed and built to deliver. And I suppose an answer I've been given previously was, it's just too big. You can't possibly deal with it through having a minister for the built environment. You'd have to have a whole set of them, which is what we've got for various bits and pieces, as customer and regulator and sponsor, but they don't talk to each other.
So you're right that one of the biggest problems in government is that we are set up constitutionally to have secretaries of state in charge of departments. And when things go across departmental boundaries, there are problems getting them to talk to each other, to manage those trade-offs between the different departments, because they are constitutionally, this is the bit I'm in charge of. And that is a problem. It's a problem you find in most places where they have the same sort of parliamentary democracy. Sometimes they get around it, like I'd say Scotland, you look at New Zealand, you look at Australia, by having one building where they put a lot of the ministers together. In terms of particular industries, you know, I suppose we don't set things up according to the size of the industry and its impact on GDP, for example. Otherwise, it'd be the financial services ministry, wouldn't it? Be the kind of would be the big one, because believe me, the amount of tax revenue we get from financial services dwarfs everything else. You know, it's like. So we need them desperately, and we're here in the city. And DEFRA, you know, you mentioned agriculture. Yeah, in the old days, math was kind of, because of, I think, that's quite a lot of history. You know, the agriculture being the most important thing, you know, that's what our economy was, and everyone cares about their food, you know, and so it's political salience is very high. So you can see why you've ended up with a DEFRA, although DEFRA is now broader, I would say, and looks after many other aspects of the environment. But the built environment, I mean, you'd have to say, you know, like everything, there are groups, you know, that look at, you know, bays has different, within bays there'll be people who look after individual different industries and should be responsible for that. So why they don't come together in one, I mean, it's not something I've heard mentioned that much. So the honest answer is I don't know. And I would say that you really need to make a good case for it. And whenever you do that, you will find that there are boundaries between that and something else. And you violated some boundaries in order to put a few together. And that will create future problems, because there's never a nice... The nice thing is if the kids all share and they all work well together. But they don't.
Next one was George.
George Stowell, I'm an architect, practice in Bermondsey. I had the privilege of being your project's architect on the Treasury for 2 years at Foster & Partners, and I'm very interested in workplace.
Yeah.
So my question is, given the challenges of Parliament at the moment in the estate, and there's 2,467 people employed on the estate, and seeing the huge benefits that were delivered actually through the executive partnership at Foster & Partners at the Treasury, what is it about the parliamentary estate that could change to be more efficient, to be more open? Because the interesting thing that you've made observations about other parliaments is that they have much more accessibility from the public, for example. People feel more connected to them. And one of the challenges, it seems to me, on the parliamentary estate is boundaries and barriers absolutely everywhere. What is it that, in terms of workplace efficiency and substitution of, you know, the use of the estate, that really could be built into what's being planned at the moment, such that the public felt much more connected over or through the fences which your presentation identified, which are everywhere. And I know that all about security on the Treasury and everything like that. But it's systemic everywhere, this security and boundaries. But people hold on to their land estate, and it's in the palace at the moment. So what needs to change to actually make things more open, more accessible, but also more efficient, because you've got to open this space up to people?
So you get to the heart of a really interesting power dilemma within the UK Constitution. So you talked about the Treasury, and thank you very much. Brilliant. I mean, the Treasury, as you know, was very old-fashioned building. It was renovated, a PFI contract, opened up. There were people in the Treasury friends who basically said, "Well, I'm not going to have this because I haven't got my own office." And it was just, when it happened, people who tuck away in their offices didn't want to be out. They all wanted to be out there. And I was permanent secretary, sitting in open plan, very visible. And you get the buzz of the place, you get the kind of feeling of what's going on. It's just, it was transformation. It's a brilliant thing. And it really helped break down some barriers and hierarchies. Ministers, of course, wouldn't leave their offices. There you go. And I think that's part of it. And so with government, you can do that. You can do that with the department. Parliament is a very different animal, and with very different power structures and all the rest of it. So as now a member of the House of Lords, I look at it and I think, oh my God, how do you get anything done? I mean, because their structures are so difficult, their decision-making bodies, there isn't when you've got a government with a decent majority, they can decide. They can say, right, we're going to start a Treasury campus up in Darlington, and they've done it. And that Treasury campus in Darlington has a number of different departments all in it, and some of the departments actually operate on the same floor, and there are no walls between them. The Treasury's up there. I was visiting them. The Treasury's up there with other people. That's unheard of, right? That's like, so you can do tremendous things. Parliament is, of course, the power structures of Parliament are, it is the sovereign body, but its control over itself is something that it finds incredibly hard to do because they're not organised to do it. I think it's fair to say, if you're a civil servant and you worked in government and in Parliament, you want to work in government. I mean, it's a gross generalisation, but in general, it's things get done. The parliamentary system is just not designed to deliver this sort of thing. They have to take some decisions which will be really quite tough and quite long term, and they're not that. They find that very hard. And the net result of that is be plans for years and years and years, and I don't expect anything to happen for a long time.
Lord O'Donnell, I'm Christopher Coombe. Thank you for a very insightful talk and very entertaining too. Following that last question and what you've just been saying, can I just explore with you the relationship between what you might call the bubble of Whitehall and Westminster and the rest of the country, where all the voters and electors are to be found? And can you give us any insights on the relationship between a very tight, the Prime Minister goes down in a lift into a car, that's where he is, and how people perceive that elsewhere in the country? And is there any insight you can offer on how that might be improved? Our perception at the moment is that the press filter a lot of the relationship between the two, but there may be other filters and other perceptions.
Yes, I mean, it's fair to say we are one of the most centralised countries in the world, right? In terms of power, in terms of the way our tax is collected and all the rest of it. And trying to decentralise that is very hard. And I've tried from the Treasury end and failed quite a few times to do that. They don't want to lose control, basically. You're right about the problem of being in Downing Street, and you try and say, this is too close, this is too London-centric. So what I did with Gordon Brown was creative regional cabinets. So we took the cabinet around the country. I remember doing one in the Rolls-Royce factory, Derby. We moved them around. The national press don't want to know, right? Don't want to know. So, you won't see any coverage of that. The regional press, you'll get a bit, but the national press is like, oh, come on, we don't want to have to go all the way to Derby. Oh my God, So, and also, of course, Prime Ministers do have their constituency. All MPs have their constituency. There are links there. You've seen it, the kind of the move towards levelling up. Everyone is aware how biased the sheer economic weight of the UK is towards London and the South East, and the financial sector in London in particular. So there are attempts to do that, and there are lots of economic forces, which we could talk about, that bring everybody together. Those whole bits about clusters and all the rest of it. And so you are fighting against lots of other forces when you try to do this. But politically, they all know they've got to get elected by the voters out in all of those constituencies. So they need to connect. And they get a lot of, time in recess to go and connect. They get a lot of, there's a great incentive structure on every MP to be in with his constituents, and they get special treatment. The Civil Service looks after their letters from constituency and all the rest of it. So there's a lot of work that goes in to try and get people to remain in touch with the country as a whole. But I think you saw during Brexit that you can, I certainly will put myself in this camp, you can get a mistaken view of what the country thinks by being too London-centric. And I remember during the run-up to the referendum, going up to and staying in a Wetherspoons pub up north, and just being amazed at how completely pro-Brexit the whole area was. And I hadn't quite twigged all of that. And so I think there is a lot to be said for finding ways for us to devolve power. I like the regional mayors. I think they're a good step forward. Andy Street, Andy Burnham idea. I think, you know, we can do more about devolving. We are too centralised. I think most of the political parties now are coming around to that view.
Yes, in the corner.
Lee Mallet, thank you very much for your work. The perception is that perhaps, you know, during your career and our lifetimes, that centralisation of power has drastically reduced the autonomy, especially the fiscal autonomy of local authorities. For monetarist reasons, you know, their finances have been very strictly controlled. If you are to achieve what you're talking about there, greater devolution and greater autonomy locally so that people can level up themselves, how do you think that might be better achieved?
So I wouldn't say there's been any particular, there's always been very strict controls on local authority borrowing, right? So they couldn't, you know, borrow on their own account, and there are all sorts of ways, because the Treasury basically knows that if they go bankrupt, Hammersmith and Fulham, you'll bail them out. So you can't give them that free go. So you've always wanted to have some controls there. I think the issue you're absolutely right about is that the amount of money going to local authorities has diminished quite radically. And that's created all sorts of problems, because local authorities have got a growing number of statutory duties and fewer resources with which to do them. And therefore they are struggling. And I think there is a real problem that if you think about the solution to some of our, you know, really big issues, I mean, you take the kind of health issue, right? The solution is not more doctors and more hospitals, right? That's just a joke, right? But that's what politicians tell you all the time. It's we're going to build 20 more hospitals, brackets, well, we're not really, but we're going to say 20 more hospitals, and we're going to have all these new doctors. And frankly, you know, actually, we need to prevent people going anywhere near a hospital. And that's a local authority. You know, if the local authorities work with schools and with other things, you know, we can create a built environment with architects, actually create spaces where, you know, it's easy to exercise and stuff like that. You know, it automatically comes, you know, people are doing the right things. But that requires you, yes, to give a bit more power, but mainly, I think, at the moment, it's to give them more money. And that's the issue at the moment, that the government's unwilling to do what will be necessary to give them more money, which is either increase taxes or cut spending somewhere else. And that's going to be really tough, because public spending is very, very high as a share of GDP already, and it's going to get higher because we're going to spend a lot more on defence. So where are you going to save money on public spending? And you know, we are about to hear during the election campaign a lot of kind of, how shall I put it, wishful thinking from all parties about how they're going to solve this problem. And you know, one of my jobs, which you didn't mention, was I'm president of the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And they will keep people honest in this. And they will say, look, you know, let's have a proper, honest debate. We keep trying to do it, but people promise to spend more and tax less. And fundamentally, Liz Truss. That's what you get.
One last question from the floor.
Thank you, Alex Healy. I worked with David Halpern and the Behavioural Insights team on an estate regeneration, and it was fascinating sort of hearing their thoughts on the nudge theory and how improving certain small things in the built environment can improve sense of security, economic opportunity, welfare, the health and well-being of residents. And I was curious to perhaps follow on a theme that's been touched on about the efficiency of government and the exchange of kind of ideas. What if anything, if the Behavioural Insights team have made any proposals for the spatial planning of number 10 to improve the effectiveness or the efficiency or the behaviour of government.
So the Behavioural Insights they've just for those, you know, was again David Cameron and during the Access talk said to me he was interested in this, and I was like, oh my God, this is brilliant, right? This is absolutely brilliant. So as an economist, I'm very into behavioural economic stuff. Dick Thaler is someone I know quite well who got the Nobel Prize for it. This sort of stuff to me is brilliant. It's unbelievably powerful and brackets quite cheap quite often. And so we set the behavioural insights team up straight away. And they did come up with, we started off coming up with ideas that were, to my mind, pretty trivial, because we needed, remember I'm in number 10 at this time, I need to persuade my old colleagues in the Treasury that this is worthwhile. And so what we did was we just changed some sentences in a letter going out to people that owed us tax, which actually made it more salient and meant that they paid their tax that they owed quicker. And that was like, we changed the letter, we got in some tens of millions, and the Treasury was like, ooh. Okay, so we expanded the Behavioural Insights team. God bless, when I left, the Behavioural Insights team is now no longer in government. It's a separate body. That's partly good because it works for countries around the world now. But yeah, there are lots of innovations you can do and lots that they work on. Together with, you mentioned about the wellbeing stuff, the What Works Centre on Wellbeing, about behaviour change to enhance people's lives, basically, to build better lives for people. And I think that's an area where if architects could get involved in that, the whole question about how in the built environment do we improve people's lives, make their lives better, make them greener, make them, lives that they feel themselves are more worthwhile and satisfying. And that's the essence of what the well-being movement is all about, is that you measure success by asking people overall, how satisfied are you with your lives? Do you feel your lives are worthwhile? And you're driven by people's perceptions of how good their lives are, not by you saying, here's a good life, this is what you've got to do to have a good life. So it would be a very radical change if a government decided that they actually wanted to improve people's lives. They don't. They have a list of tasks, and the manifestos will be a list of tasks, things they want. It's like the coalition programme, a list of tasks. We're going to build 100 free schools. Why? Because we're going to build 100 free schools. What is it you're trying to achieve? Do you want to improve educational outcomes? Because if they are, let's have a discussion about what's the right way to improve educational outcomes. But that's the problem. It's a bit like someone coming to you with a building and saying, I want a building that's 10 stories high. It's like, well, why? Actually, surely when they come to you, you should say, we want a building that achieves these objectives, these outcomes. And then you go off and do it. And most of my life, I said the biggest failing of governments is that failure to think about what they want to achieve. It's not maximising GDP. It's really stupid, and we know how to do that, and it's really dumb. So it is about, making people's lives better, and how do we do that? And that's where I think the architects could be brilliant in that part.
Well, definitely we need more of them. So very, very quickly, because we should break for a drink in a moment.
Thank you very much. Lord Donald, thank you for the very good talk that you delivered this evening. My question is about the need of the Prime Minister, basically at the very high level independent decision-making point, where because they are all the time surrounded by security or by the in a kind of domestic or political environment, I would doubt that they would ever get a moment in which they could kind of totally independently be able to reflect on their own thinking for decision makings of situation as important as the decisions to send to the navies, and I don't know whether they ever kind of, one prime minister gets to know what the other prime minister's decision was, but to make such decisions, I would kind of imagine that one would need to have a chamber of thinking or a chamber of decision making. Have you ever kind of heard from any of the prime ministers that you've worked with to kind of say, oh my God, I really need to have a space to go and kind of be away from everything around me to think and reflect and make a decision? Because that would be very important in designing a place for. Thank you.
Well, that's, in a sense, that's why we have the country houses. So Foreign Secretary's got Chevening, Prime Minister's got, where?
Checkers.
Checkers, that's the one, yeah, I was kind of, just left my mind, Checkers, yeah. And Checkers is lovely, you know, nice swimming pool, tennis court, nice place for them to go away and think. And you're absolutely right, it's just really important to get time for them, because, you know, when I mentioned about how unhealthy the job is, you know, it's all of the things about no exercise and all this shit, but also the decisions that go to them are all the hardest decisions, because everyone else takes the easy decisions. The ones that go to them, they're like, there's a bad decision and then there's even worse decision. You know, all decisions have losers, and it's a question of how many losers do you want, or what kind of losers do you want. And the winners, you can be absolutely guaranteed, will keep quiet, and the losers will scream. That's the nature of this. So it is a very stressful time. I mean, you imagine that Boris Johnson dealing with COVID. You know, that's you know, we were in unprecedented space and all sorts of things. Things were happening. The data was terrible to start with. You know, that is very stressful, and he got ill himself. So, you know, you can understand. So I agree with you. It's nice to have them think on their own. But part of the problem with that is, as long as they're with, you know, like sometimes they think about things within a world that they've got in their heads, which is actually wrong. And so they need to understand certain facts, certain objective data. So you need to brief them about, you know, the nature of these things, give them information, be on hand to ask questions for them. But you are absolutely right. In the end, all of our ministers, their number one job is decision-making under uncertainty. And of course, you know, how long did all of you spend studying architecture to be allowed to be architects? How long did any minister spend studying decision-making under uncertainty before they became an MP? That is the problem, right?
Well, thank you very much, Gus, for a wonderful talk.